into it. So I have with me New York Times bestselling author Tom Foster. He wrote a book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. That was really instrumental in my understanding about the ways that you read a story like a mature academic. Obviously, this book has had great impact on a lot of people who are interested in developing a deeper understanding of the literary canon. He also was friends with my grandma, which makes me like him. So I'll let him introduce himself, and then we can get into some questions.
Hi, I'm Thomas C. Foster. I don't go by Thomas or C, so Tom is fine. I taught for many years at the University of Michigan, Flint. And along the way, I had occasion, because a regular academic project failed, to come up with this book, How to Read Literature Like a Professor. And I never thought it would sell. I never thought a publisher would pick it up. But I had to do something to justify the money the university spent on my sabbatical. So I did this thing, and it worked out way beyond my wildest dreams. And I've done several more books since then. I won't bore you with the titles, except to say they're all pretty long, and when you add on the snarky subtitles, they're even longer.
That's funny. Cool. Well, so I think that How to Read Literature Like a Professor is particularly valuable, not only because it takes you through the literary devices, but because it's very humble. I feel like the first, in the introduction, you describe a professor as someone who has had a little bit more time to develop an understanding of the literary apparatus, you say in your introductory chapter. Pretty much from then on, you talk about these, I don't know, I guess you could characterize them as like hoity-toity literary devices, but you really do it in a level way that allows anyone reading to just understand that there's a code in literature, and that as writers use this code, they're trying to make points about the human condition, all of the things that writers talk about. So how did you develop that style of writing?
Well, I worked really hard on this style to make it look like I wasn't working. I had to get rid of all the and I knew this was necessary because of my audience, which I'll get to in a moment. They didn't want a whole bunch of jargon and a lot of $5 words. They wanted someone to tell them about what I'm talking about in fairly simple terms. And I'm simple enough that works out pretty well for me. I had in mind, I had no idea that this book would catch on with high school English classes, and especially not with high school advanced placement classes, which it has done to a gratifying degree. I was writing, and I'm not making this up, for a 37-year-old divorced nurse who's come back to college, and this time around, since she's paying for it herself instead of daddy paying for it and only allowing her to go to nursing school, she wants to do the stuff she's really interested in, which is read books and think about books and ideas. And there's a mostly male counterpart to this. And when I started, nurses were almost uniformly female in the 80s. And then even into the early 2000s, it was chiefly a female occupation. The sort of male equivalent, because I was teaching in Flint, Michigan, was the laid-off auto worker, who had always been a closet reader and was, because other guys saw him with books, and there were some women who came out of the assembly line too and were in my courses. But this guy was seen with books by people who didn't use books for very much, except maybe as paperweights, and they'd call him professor or something like that. which is, by the way, the same thing they do to guys on sports teams, pro sports teams, if they are ever caught with a book. And I knew that they had read a great deal because they would tell me they read a great deal, but they were very nervous about one aspect in particular. And the way it usually was couched was, I just don't get symbolism. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I can help with that. And so I deal not just with symbolism, but with various kinds of figurative usage. So metaphor and symbolism and allegory and all the rest. And that's really where it came from. And I knew these people wanted me to give it to them straight. And since I didn't think it was going to be ordered for classes, I thought they were going to be reading it because they wanted to. And the way that you make people want to read something is to make it interesting and fun and, a little hokey sometimes. I'm good at hokey. So that's how the approach came about.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So what I'm hearing is that your students at Flint were not necessarily people who were in academic environments, but who really wanted to learn. And you spent a long time, talking to people about literature before you wrote the book. And when you wrote the book, you wanted to make it interesting, and you were talking to people you knew, like that nurse that you mentioned. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, awesome. So my first question is actually pertaining to one of the last chapters, one of the chapters in the middle, which is about political novels. You say that you don't really like heavy-handed political writing that uses characters, but that every novel is political, right? Or you say that there's a lot of political undertones in what we think of as literature and stories, and I think that you use Charles Dickens as a major example in that chapter. So when does a piece of literature turn into just political commentary, and where's that line drawn between politics using characters and an actual novel talking about something important?
Well, that's one of those situations where I think it's in the eye of the beholder. When I feel that there are ideas running around arguing with one another, and they're merely using characters to express those ideas, that's the kind of novel that doesn't really interest me too much. I'll give it a chance and I'll see where it's going. But there are lots and lots of novels that either support the existing power structure in a country, or bring it into question, not because they're wanting to bring it into question or they're wanting to support it, but that's simply where the writer stands. And it can go either way. And so you want, first of all, strong, vivid characters doing interesting things that are interesting because of the action and the person doing the action, and not simply because that's the idea that the writer is forcing upon the narrative. And there are lots of contrived novels and plays, for that matter, that just don't really feel very alive to me, and I sort of demand liveliness out of my fiction and drama and poetry.
So one of the aspects of creating a lively plot is by letting the plot be character driven, and by creating a person who, when faced with situations, is going to respond naturally to the situations they face. Would you say that's so? That's kind of the
Yeah, I think you need characters who have and main characters here we're talking chiefly, who have a sort of complete personality. They have a backstory, they have a personal history. that causes them to be this way and not some other way, who have strengths and weaknesses of character. They may be honorable, but they can be cowardly, or they can be brave, but they can be a little bullying. Whatever that combination is, we want to see that stay fairly consistent. The two big things with character are consistency. We want to know it's the same person all the way through, and change, or at least the capacity for change. Can they grow based on the experiences that they have? Which experiences grow out of who they are in the first place? The best way I can express this is to quote other people. William Faulkner said that, I find these characters and I just trot around behind them with a notebook writing down what they do. And yeah, it's a metaphor, but it's only kind of a metaphor. He really did have the sense that his characters were going off and doing amazing and sometimes awful and sometimes wonderful things because of who they were. And once he got the character, I don't think he felt like he was really in control. Now you're saying, okay, well, William Faulkner, he's one of the greats. This is pretty highfalutin stuff. Leonora, Jane Marie's grandmother, and I were friends with the screenwriter Jim Cash. And Jim, he wrote something called Top Gun, you might have heard of, and Legal Eagles. And I'm sorry to say that his last film before he died was the Flintstones, Viva Rock Vegas, which he kind of took over because somebody had to, and that's a long story. But he said, your characters will tell you when you're forcing something on them. If you have, for instance, this was one of his examples, if you make two characters run into each other accidentally once, that's okay. The second time, maybe it works out okay. If you do it a third time, one of them is going to say, we got to stop meeting like this, or something less cliched than that. But basically, they're going to say, I'm getting tired of this act. And Jim said, they're not talking to the other character. They're talking to you. Mm-hmm. So writers really do believe that the characters have a sort of life of their own. I don't want to say that every writer is delusional and sees the characters out in front of them all the time. Mm-hmm. But rather that they have a life of their own. They will make their own choices. And if you try to force something on them, they will speak back to you and say, that's not really a good idea. And according to Jim Cash, you had to listen for that. You had to watch out that was happening.
Mm-hmm. So when you taught, did you normally do literature or did you teach creative writing?
I mostly taught literature. My specialty was 20th century because when I got trained, the 20th century was a long way from over. I started graduate school I started undergraduate school in the 70s and went right on through to graduate school. So there was, still a good many years left in that century. So I was doing the sort of high modernist period of Hemingway and James Joyce and, all those folks. And then what was called the contemporary or postmodern period, which was maybe from 1960 on. And as the new century dawned, I just kind of moved on along with current writers because they do keep coming along, and the older ones keep producing material. But I also taught a lot of introductions to literature, introduction to reading fiction and drama. I got dragooned into teaching the literature of Greece and Rome because the two people who had done it retired and somebody had to do it. It wasn't because I was highly qualified, but I really liked doing it. It was a lot of fun teaching the Iliad and Sophocles' plays, the Oedipus Theban cycle. Mm-hmm. So I had a wider background because I was at UM Flint and it was an undergraduate school, and we weren't a huge department in terms of our literature staff. I got a much wider breadth of teaching than I would have gotten had I been at a school where I could be a pure specialist in 20th century lit. And I think that was, I always liked the variety anyway, but I think it was a real gift in terms of being able to write these books that I've written. So that's kind of where all that came from. Was just I had to do this stuff. Some of it I had to, like the Greek and Roman stuff, I had to learn on the fly, as it were. Whereas I knew it, but I didn't know it, and to teach it, you've got to be right on top of it.
So I know that you were in a writers group with my grandma, and for context, my grandma primarily taught creative writing, and in a way, she faced a lot of problems with people trying to superimpose literary devices on a story that really isn't character driven. And one of the main techniques that she would use to try to get people to create things is just get rid of all of the 5-paragraph essay and all of the literary devices that you're taught that make writing good. And I want you to think of a moment of substance, and I want you to write about it. Think about something that had a profound meaning on your life and write about it. And she would coordinate workshops where college students had to interpret the drawings of second graders. I think that she once reached out to a second grade art teacher and had his students draw, and then they delivered the drawings, and then the college students had to write based on those drawings from the perspective of a second grader, and just just channeling that raw imagination that you have when you're a child and you don't yet understand literature. So in that sense, how do you reconcile the fundamental creative imagination with the way that it develops as you learn to read great works?
That's a really interesting and complicated question. I think that when we read, the first thing we do is try to take in the story, or in the case of a poem, sort of the argument that's going on. This is a person walking in the woods, making a decision about which way to go, not that I want to see what that symbolizes. We don't start there. Mm-hmm. And if we do start there, we often fall on our face because we didn't pay enough attention to what's actually written. Mm-hmm. So, when we read, the first obligation is to read the words that are there. Mm-hmm. And this is particularly true of poetry because it's such a more compressed form, but it's true of novels as well. To read the words that are there. Don't read any words that aren't there. Don't start putting things in because you thought that would be there, but it wasn't. And so you're following your expectation rather than the actual words on the page. And read all of them. Don't skip words. The obvious thing would be if you miss a not in a sentence, that's going to wind up changing your understanding of what's going on in that story or that poem. But it's broader than that. We can miss a lot because we only halfway read, or we assume what's going to happen, or we impose our own language in between the text that's there and our brain. Somewhere about the back of the eye, this word gets interposed that shouldn't be there, or this idea does, or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the first thing we have to do. All of the stuff about figurative usage that I talk about is really a secondary or tertiary idea. And what I would tell students, what I say in my writing, is listen for it. Okay, there are the words that are there, and then there are these little chimes that go off. You hear this little ding. It's like, I've seen that before. I've seen a character like this before, or I've heard that language before. And then you think, now where did I see that before? Okay, and so now we are moving away from the text, but with any luck, we have the text firmly in mind. So we can do that. We can say, okay, this is, I've seen clouds used like this before. I've seen a gathering storm. Gathering storms sometimes mean something beyond their literal truth, or the journey to accomplish something, the quest, often means something beyond just going to the store and picking up a loaf of Wonder Bread. So we get there as we get there. But I think if we try to start there, even if it's a writer who's very symbolic, we come to grief if that's the first thing we start looking for, because we stop paying attention to the actual narrative or argument or whatever it is on the page.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that James Joyce is one of the only authors who I've interacted with who can really make symbolism the primary focus of the text as opposed to the substance of the text. And short of that, okay, that is kind of a controversial interpretation of James Joyce, but in general, I think that most of the time, when you write a book, you're writing for a substance. And that substance, I know that my grandma used to say that essentially what you're doing is having a conversation with your ancestors, because obviously every human has experienced grief and shame and sorrow and guilt and pain and all of the emotions that are fundamentally human. And you have experienced that in your life, but also all humans who have ever written literature have also experienced those exact same things. So if you're trying to express a fundamentally human moment in your life, in your writing, at some point you're going to allude to something else that someone else experienced, and that someone else probably wrote down. So the great, the things that we draw on in the past, I think that, obviously the Bible is kind of the Bible, and also the ancient Greek, Sophocles and all of that, the Greek canon, the Grecian canon, that's what it's called. Thank you. And the Bible kind of informed Shakespeare. And then in your book, you have a list of quotes from Shakespeare. What is it? When in doubt, it's Shakespeare.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask you about was, so a lot of times you can interpret a work based on your own experience interacting with the text, right? But there's a certain point at which your interpretation of the text is just not really correct, right? English professors have to get to a point where it's look, you're interacting with this text, but at a certain point you're no longer interacting with the text, and that interpretation isn't really correct. And I think the example that you use in your book is Toni Morrison, where a lot of people want to superimpose this idea of flying in the Songs of Solomon, but she's actually referring to the myth of flying Africans, right? Mm-hmm. And you would say, well, that's a misreading. So how do you where do you draw the line? When is a person's personal interpretation a misreading of literature?
Well, I'm not sure that I would call it, she would, but I'm not sure I would call it a misreading. We try to use what we have. Mm-hmm. And for most of us, now Song of Solomon came out in, I think, 1977. Most of us who are not of African heritage, and I think a great many people who are, did not have access to that myth when the book came out. Now, because it came out, and because this notion of Africans having once been able to fly is sufficiently present in the novel, we can buy into that. But our mind wants to stick other things on, and sometimes they just don't work. What you have to do, I think, is take the thing that you know and that you want to append to this story, and ask, is it advancing understanding at all? Okay, Icarus is about a young boy. His father has made these wings, Daedalus, his father, has made these wings for both of them to fly off of the island of Crete where they're being held and back to the mainland. And he's told, don't go too near the sun, the wax will melt, you'll fall into the sea. Don't go too near the water, the feathers will get wet, you'll fall into the sea. Results the same either way. And of course, Icarus is a young boy. He's an adolescent in essence. And it's like giving your 16-year-old a muscle car and saying, don't drive fast. Well, that's going to be a big help. So he goes too near the sun because he wants to soar up and he wants to enjoy all this. And remember, the sun in ancient Greece was perceived as being a whole lot closer than it really is. So that mattered. But in any case, disaster ensues because he doesn't stick to the middle course. And that's the lesson there. But I've thought about this a lot, and I just can't make that stick in Song of Solomon. So the first item is notice something. The second is use what you know. And the third is take a pretty hard look and see if it's doing anything useful with the text. Is it telling you something that you need to know or that makes more sense of the text than it formerly made? And we've all had the experience, I think, of having to jettison some fond wish that we had about how this works out, or I know this other thing and I can bring it in. And the more effort you have to expend stuffing this thing into this box of the new work, the more you should come to recognize it's probably not a good point. It's probably not going to work out well. So it's trial and error, and there's a lot of error involved. And the more books you've read and the more things you've tried, the more you find out that that's true. At other times, you'll go, oh, this flight, disaster, Icarus, yeah, I can make that work. But it depends on the specific work. And whether or not your writer knows anything about flying Africans. So we're kind of back there.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's pretty well said. It's like it's a thing where you have to use the knowledge of the books that you already know. And it would be valid if someone like read a poem and they said, it reminded me of this piece of work which predated the poem, which was written after the poem was written, like even if the author who wrote it doesn't know what's going to be written in the future, if a student says, this reminded me of this, then essentially they are engaging with the work, right? And there's something valuable about that comparison, even though it might not be, something that the author intended. So when do you think that it is possible for a piece of literature to have symbolism that the author did not intend?
I've gotten that question a lot. Do you think he really intended to do that? And my answer is, we don't need to know whether he intended it. If the effect is there, he or she, since we're just mentioning Toni Morrison, may have plotted that all out. And some writers are big on that, and some work very instinctively. And instinct is driven by not just whim, but by knowledge and understanding. And so you don't have to think, okay, now I have somebody on a trip. I want that to stand for achieving self-knowledge. They don't have to do that because they've read it so often. It's just in there. It will come out. You can't keep it from coming out. There are as many levels of intentionality as there are writers. Some, and you mentioned Joyce, some control every aspect of the work, and spend years and years and years getting things just so, and some. I'll call it the D.H. Lawrence school, since they were contemporaries of each other. Material just pours forth. Lawrence, who wrote a great deal more than Joyce did in considerably fewer years. He died at just 45 of tuberculosis. He had all this stuff stored in somewhere in him, in his brain, in his soul, somewhere, and it just would come out at tremendous rates. I think he wrote Women in Love, the first draft, in 6 weeks, which works out to almost 10,000 words a day. That's about 40 typed pages. You cannot, well, most of us cannot do that, period, but you cannot write at that rate and keep tight control of every aspect of planning and execution. You're just letting the instinct take over. And sometimes he does things that are garishly stupid, and sometimes he's just utterly brilliant, and that's kind of how that'll go. But some writers are okay with having less control than Joyce did, and that Joyce insisted on.
So what's an example of a stupid book?
Well, I don't know. Do I talk about stupid books in the book? I don't think I do. I think there's some books that are trying too hard to do something that the writer isn't capable of. Mm-hmm. And some of you will hate me for this, but I see it with some regularity in self-published books. Mm-hmm. And self-published books, everybody who likes them says, well, you don't have gatekeepers. You can get your own ideas out there, and all that is true. But some of your ideas maybe need more seasoning. I've had many experiences, and I'm pretty good at editing myself, where readers who are friends, and Leonora was one of them, or my editors will say, are you sure you want that? I don't think that's working the way you think it's working. And I have been saved from trouble, not to say I've never gotten into any, but I've been saved from trouble any number of times by somebody having a better idea than I did about what's going on.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I studied a lot of, my degree is in comparative literature and Arabic, but I did a lot of creative writing workshops when I was at Emory, and I think that there's a real problem. If you're serious about producing creative writing, there's a real problem in just telling people that it's good, because it is important to be able to go through that editing process. And also that editing process can seem so scary the first time. Like putting your book in front of other people to read, or your writing can feel like standing naked in front of a room full of people. It's just the most terrifying, your intimate thoughts for 20 minutes just have to be exposed. On the one hand, there's this impulse to tell people hey, this is good, but I think that it's definitely true that the editing process is super important, super duper important as you go on. So what does editing look like for you? And also, how did you end up publishing?
Okay, editing, when most people think of editing, they think of inserting semicolons or taking them out. And that's part of it. There are several different levels. That one we would put under copy editing and maybe proofreading, but there's a level of editing that's well before that. That says, first of all, yeah, this book as a whole is good, or it's not good, and that's the gatekeeping part that none of us is really crazy about, because being told something isn't publishable, or simply that a certain editor at a certain house doesn't want it, that doesn't feel good. And sometimes it's a sign that you would have the wrong editor. The book may be okay, and they may tell you, I think it's okay, I think it's pretty good here or there, but it's not for me, it's not for this publisher, I think. So you might want to try somewhere else. That can work. A lot of times editing is at the level of story or argument where the editor will say, we need to hear more from this character on this subject. You kind of take it as understood, but I'm not sure it should be taken as understood. It should be expressed more directly. Or you're beating us over the head with it, remove some of that and let it seem more organic in the present. And that's the kind of editing that I think it really helps you and saves you from dopiness, which has occasionally happened. You think something's really good and you think something's really clever, and it turns out to be what the Brits call too clever by half. It's you tried a little too hard there, Buster. So that's what I rely on my editor to do, and they oblige in varying degrees. Some are pretty heavy-handed. Most of them leave my material alone for the most part, but they step in where they feel that they need to. That's very important. What happened with my getting published is there's another level of gatekeeping that's in modern publishing, and that's the literary agent. And this started, I don't know, in the 90s, maybe a little earlier. A lot of publishing houses, they used to have like junior editors, junior readers who read the material and passed it on to an editor and said, there's something here, I think you can work with this. And then they decided, I don't know how they decided, I don't think there was a convention where it was said or anything like that. It became more and more that they outsourced that level of judgment to literary agents, and the literary agents have their own junior level assistants who are called interns. Intern is from the Latin for you don't get paid. But what happened with my book was I sent it to an agency, or actually sent the proposal, the query letter to an agency. You don't send the whole book in a work of nonfiction unless they want to see it. And the first agency said, they were pretty quick about it. And they said, yeah, we don't think so. Okay, it's interesting, but it's not the kind of thing that we know how to sell. Now, fortunately, there are lots of agencies. The second one I sent it to, in about 2 weeks, I got a call from the one who became my agent, is still my agent. And she said, our intern picked your query letter out of and a query letter is simply a description of what's in the book and why you're the perfect person to write it, and please publish it. That's the short version, but it's what's going on there. Our intern, Rob, which is also my older son's name, pulled this out of the slush pile, which sounds ugly, but it's just a stack of unsolicited query letters and proposals and some stuff they probably shouldn't have had sent. And he thought it was kind of interesting. And she confessed, I'm not a literature person. I got into this by way of marketing books. So I'm taking his word for it because he was an English major at a good school and he thought there was something here. So why don't you send us more? So I wrote up a proposal and sent a couple of sample chapters with that, and she got it, and then she sent it around to the different publishers. There are all these names of publishers, but there are only about 5 different houses among major publishing anymore. There used to be dozens, and now there's a lot of consolidation, but they've kept a lot of the names. I'm with HarperCollins. At one time, Harper and Brothers, and then Harper and Row, was its own publisher, and William Collins Publishing was a different venture. And then they merged. They dropped the whatever followed Harper in the original, and it became HarperCollins. So that kind of contraction has been going on for, well, it's always gone on. Sometimes little publishers didn't make it and they got absorbed, and they had a few books that somebody wanted on their list instead, but you don't need to know all that. Simply that there are only a handful of publishers this needs to get sent to, and one of them, the editor said, yeah, we like the idea. We want to see it, okay? And so I got a contract. I got the smallest monetary contract you can get, and I was delighted to have it. And at that, I really, really hoped that I would make back my tiny advance, which I did, and it happened in the first year, and that was also thrilling. And it's been going ever since, and I revised it for publication of a new edition in 2014, and I'm currently in the latter stages doing the same thing again, because 10 years is about enough for a book that's really a textbook to not change, and especially when the market, the high school English market, has been changing quite rapidly in the last, since 2014 when I published the book. It started changing almost immediately.
Definitely. So, is there a list of literary agencies out there, or do you just Google them? Or
Well, you can Google them. There have been from time to time, I don't know what's current now, people who sort of keep track of agencies, because they're not all created equal. A few of them that pretend to be agencies are basically scam artists. And you really want to know the difference, and you really want to know if they're charging exorbitant reading fees. Most agencies traditionally have not charged a reading fee. I think it's been coming on in greater degree in recent times, although I haven't been on the market for an agent for a long time and hope never to be. So I can't say for sure. But there are two reference works you can check out at a public library. One is called Writer's Market. It is by no means comprehensive, but it has the agencies and publishing houses and magazines. You remember magazines, right? That are looking for work, and they tell you what their standards are, and excuse me, what needs to happen, and how soliciting for publication should go. And then the other one is called Literary Marketplace. It has a lot less description, but a much bigger list. And Literary Marketplace is usually kept, if they have it in a library, and some really small libraries might not, it's kept behind the main desk. So you have to go to the librarian and ask for it, because they really don't want people walking off with that thing. It's of that kind of significance. So yeah, you can find out where publishers are, and from there you can Google them, and you see somebody who sounds interesting, you need to Google it, and you get 10 people saying, I would never use this person again. Oh my God, or they say this is the most wonderful experience I've had. Like everything, it's all adjudicated in the public mind anymore. So you can find out a lot more than you could 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
So I want to go back to editing as we wrap up this interview. I can tell you what I think is the hallmark of an undeveloped piece, and it's something that you talked about at the beginning with trust your characters. Your characters will tell you something. I think that if there is a moment of divine intervention, if there are multiple moments of divine intervention, or if it just so happens, like I recently read a story from, someone who contacted me online because they saw that I had published my book and gotten into Barnes and Noble, and they were like, "Hey, do you wanna read my story?" And I said yes, because at this point in my life, I'm not getting too many of those queries, and I'm really happy to talk to people about their writing. And the issue with the manuscript was that this like average Joe was divinely picked by the powers that be to go on this adventure for no reason. He had no like compelling like thing about him that would have made him valuable to the powers that be. And he goes on this grand adventure, and then like other people are like, "Oh, well, you did this," and then this next character set comes in, and they just help him right in the nick of time. And it's like, well, why did they help him? What did he do for them in return? So I think that divine intervention is kind of a cheap way to get out of world building. And I think that that's definitely something, if you're looking to seriously like edit your book, take out everything needs to be a transaction. Everything needs to be a problem. Nobody, because the problems that the characters are solving is the way that you relate character development to plot. Like there's a circularity between developing a plot and developing a character, and that is done through the problems that the character solves. And then another thing that I would say is consistency in your character. That's what I would say. Do you have anything to add to that list?
Not really. The sort of standard dictum is that action grows out of character. Okay, action happens, and therefore plot happens, because it will get structured at some point. Because certain characters have certain qualities, certain traits, certain obsessions, certain hostilities, whatever it might be, that spark conflict, that spark action, that will then move things forward. So it is a reflection on one level of character. It's also a driver of character, because the action makes that character respond in certain ways. They suddenly find courage, or they find that they don't have the courage they thought they had, or whatever it may be. So I think you really need to understand that action and character are not separate things. They're one thing. They just look separate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to end this interview with a rather spicy question. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, and that I actually brought up at the very end of what I said at my grandma's celebration of life, which you attended. And it was the fact that writers and artists tend to have a very high the population of writers and artists has an abnormally high affliction of sadness and mental health issues, right? And that's like Ernest Hemingway, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, like you just on and on and on. Writers tend to have these tormented internal experiences. And I wanted to ask you, as a professor who's kind of been involved in the same circles that like my grandma was involved in, and you guys were like creating novels when you guys were in that group together. Why do you think that artists tend to? Do you think that it's artists? Do you think that it's writers specifically, or what? Do you think that there's a connection between internal tumult and writing?
Well, I don't know. It does seem that way, and I can't think of a very long list of really well-adjusted people who became great artists. But I might be missing a few of them. I think there has to be something that makes you need to write or to paint or to compose. And I don't think that something that compels that is generally happiness. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I've known lots and lots of people who have various kinds of mental, psychological, call them what you are, difficulties, who are not at all inclined toward art. Right. So, I think it's sort of the human condition that on some level we're unhappy or we're driven, and that drive is often out of unhappiness. And the outlet suggests itself to us. And the outlet can be anything from writing novels to taking up drugs or drinking or both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, as we know. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just one of the ways that people can deal with the unhappiness they find in life. Mm-hmm. And it may be that the ones who have the biggest beef with life are the ones that really pursue getting that out of their system somehow. And it seems cliche to talk about the tormented artist, but a lot of them have been tormented, or at times tormented. So I hope it's possible to be well-adjusted and still be artistic. But I don't know. The examples are not real thick on the ground.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that if the bigger beef that you have, the greater need you have to get it out. You put it really well. I botched it. Do you have any final remarks?
Well, often when people have read How to Read Literature Like a Professor and liked it, and they use it, they will give me this quasi-complaint that now I can't go to a movie and turn off that faculty. I see all this stuff going on. I see the connections. It's like everything is an Easter egg now for me to unpack. And I think that's fine. I also think turning that faculty off is fine. If you can. I can't. I've been at this so long that I'm sort of stuck with who I am. But it's okay if you can do both things at once, if you want to enjoy the movie that's in front of you or the television show that's in front of you. And then part of you also wants to analyze it after the fact. That's okay. Don't burden your friends unduly with your analysis. That's the only thing I would recommend. Is that doesn't always go well. My second son has a very good cinematic aesthetic. He understands what good movies are. He also likes gross out comedies, not for their artistic merit. So you can do many different things with literature, with cinema, whatever it is. You're not stuck just being one thing all the time, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Welcome.